Oliver Twist Literary Analysis by TaeVon Gibbs. Let's go. Oliver Twist is a novel written by Charles Dickens, originally published serially from 1837 to 1839, but was released in a 3-volume book series in 1838. The story of Oliver Twist follows a young boy named Oliver and basically tells his life story. He had a pretty rough life. His mom died right after giving birth to him. He runs away from his foster home at the age of 9, gets manipulated into being a thief. He ends up getting shot in the arm, just a whole bunch of mess. But luckily, all does work out for him in the end. I will go into more depth because this is a really interesting book, but you are not here for a summary, you are here for an analysis. Let's do that. Throughout all of Oliver's ups and downs, Dickens touches on many themes, such as systemic poverty, identity, classism, and many, many more things. But the main one that I'll be focusing on today is that people are not naturally born evil, but can become evil due to their surroundings. That's more of a general world-like version of the theme, so let me break it down more in terms of the story. Social class does not define who you are or make you innately evil. Your surroundings do. To be more specific, by social class I mean poor people, and by surroundings I mean the city of London. And speaking of London, that brings us to our first literary element, setting. Majority of this novel takes place in London, and Dickens is not particularly kind to London. The city of London is basically used as a symbol for bad, and being in a bad environment like London will make you a bad person. And Dickens shows this as all the bad people, aka Fagins and Sykes and many more, live in the city. Whereas on the other side, you have the countryside, and that's where Rose and Mrs. Maylie live. So Dickens uses setting as a symbol for good versus evil. And there's examples of this all throughout the novel, but there are so many in chapter 32. For example, let's take a look at page 277. When talking about the countryside, the narrator says, "Who can describe the pleasure and delight, the peace of mind and soft tranquility the sickly boy felt in the balmy air and among the green hills and rich woods of an inland village?" And then literally the very next sentence, when talking about the city, the narrator says, "Who can tell how scenes of peace and quietude sink into the minds of pain-worn dwellers in close and noisy places, and carry their own freshness deep into their jaded hearts?" Just take a look at the words used to describe the places. Whenever it's the countryside, it's balmy and rich and green. But whenever it's the city, it's noisy, close, and jaded. And that's just one of many examples. And that plays into our theme because London is described as filthy and close, and that creates Fagin, while the countryside is described as beautiful and green, and that creates Rose. The surroundings, that is. Dickens uses these two distinctions as symbols for good and bad. And that goes right into our next literary device, symbolism. Charles Dickens uses symbolism in the setting, as I've already talked about, but he also uses them in the characters. And the two characters I'll be talking about is Fagin and Oliver. And again, these two characters represent good and evil. These are two morally ambiguous characters. Thank you for teaching me that today, Dr. Wright. And Dickens uses this moral ambiguity to show two different outcomes to make his point to the audience that you are not born into a certain life, but you may choose a certain life due to your surroundings. Take a look for Oliver for an example. He's treated like crap from the jump, but he never really shows any negative emotions. He's never angry or sad. The only person he really gets with is Noah, and that's because he talked about his dead mom. And Oliver is a poor orphan who has nowhere to go, but yet he does not become a criminal. Even in chapter 10, whenever he becomes aware of what Fagin's gang is doing, he runs away. And then again later in the novel, whenever they are supposed to rob the Maylies, Oliver still does not want to participate. And that shows his natural innocence and his natural goodness in a way. And it serves as evidence that just because you are born poor does not mean that you have to have a poor personality or become a criminal. More evidence of this is shown when on page 179 the text reads, "The boy was laying fast asleep on a rude bed upon the floor, so pale with anxiety and sadness in the closest of his prison that he looked like death, not death as it shows in shroud and coffin, but in the guise it wears when life has just departed, when a young and gentle spirit has in an instant fled to heaven, and the gross air of the world has not had time to breathe upon the changing dust it's hallowed." And that piece of text, the narrator is referencing Oliver, but Oliver's poor, and he looks like heaven? What? That's the point that Charles Dickens is trying to make. Being poor does not define Oliver. Oliver's personality defines Oliver. And in that very moment, someone as evil as Fagin couldn't even take it upon himself to try to make Oliver evil. But speaking of Fagin, let's talk about him. As we know, Fagin is the exact opposite of Oliver. Fagin is manipulative and evil, and he makes young boys steal for him. And Fagin's manipulation is like a living representation of the theme that I pointed out. Fagin is purposefully taking advantage of these young boys and making them out to be these evil people. They are not naturally or innately evil. It's just being passed down from Fagin to them. There's proof of this on page 177 when Fagin is talking about manipulating Oliver. The text reads, I've had my eye upon him. My dears, close. Once let him feel that he is one of us. Once fill his mind with the idea that he's been a thief. And he's ours for his life. Oh ho, it couldn't have come about better. And with that type of attitude, it's hard to try to believe that Fagin is naturally evil himself. As an audience, we don't know much about Fagin's backstory, but through quotes like this, we can safely assume that Fagin was most likely a manipulator himself, which again feeds right into the theme of no one being innately evil. And Charles Dickens very creatively uses these morally ambiguous characters as symbols to represent this theme. And speaking of characters, let's talk about our last literary element, characterization. I've kind of already talked about characterization, but with the main characters. And Dickens also uses characterization to show the theme in the side characters. The side characters I will be looking at are Monks, Bates, and Noah. Monks, as we find out at the end of the novel, is actually Oliver's half-brother, and he comes from a good family. But he's also one of Fagin's thugs. And this shows that it's not just the poor people that are going to become these criminals, it's everyone. Which means, again, at the end of the day, your social class does not define who you are. There's evidence of this on page 445 when the text reads, he had left her, when only 18, robbed her of jewels and money, gambled, squandered, forged, and fled to London, where for 2 years he had associated with the lowest outcasts. And with that statement, the narrator tells us that what Monks did was his choice. He was not forced into that. And to prove even more that it's not your fate, let's look at Master Charles Bates. Rhyming accidentally. But on page 464 it reads, Master Charles Bates, appalled by Sykes' crime, fell into a train of reflection whether an honest life was not after all the best. Arriving at the conclusion that it certainly was, he turned his back upon the scenes of the past, resolved to amend it in some new sphere of action. And with that statement, the narrator is telling us that even in this world, you can change. That you can go from a life of crime to a life of peace. Or in Monks' case, you can go from a life of peace to a life of crime. It's all up to you and it's all your choice. And in conclusion, I think that's what Charles Dickens was trying to prove with this novel. That your social status does not define who you are. Oliver started this off as a poor orphan who had to run away to London, a place that he hates, to a person that now has enough money to move out to the countryside where he loves it. And at the end of the day, Charles Dickens, through uses of characterizations, symbolism, and setting, just because you start off as a poor baby in the big city doesn't mean you can't retire in a nice countryside. That isn't directly what it means, but I think you get the gist. Thanks for listening.